Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Solo Spooky Story. My name's Rob, and today I'll be your host. For those of you that don't know, the Solo Spooky Stories are shorter episodes presented every other week by myself, where I'll talk about something that I found particularly interesting that week, or, a listener submission on something that they'd like us to talk about, or, something else that I just find particularly interesting, and I just want to share it with all you lovely listeners. And yeah, people seem to like it. Today, actually, I'm trying something a little bit different, which I would love listener feedback on to let me know what you think. So recently I got a little bit of feedback from some people saying that they would like to hear kind of a longer form informative episode where I'll just kind of go through a specific case and kind of give all the facts, present the timelines, all that sort of stuff if they're there. It was in the context of UFO episodes and things like that, and they'd love to hear something like that. So I'm going to try that today. Give me your feedback on it. Let me know what you think, and if this is something that you'd be interested in hearing more, I can dot them in every once in a while and kind of provide, I suppose, more longer form episodes where we'll be a little bit more fact-based, which is shocking for me, I know, but someone or a few people seemed interested, so we'll give it a shot, see what you think. And it's a perfect excuse for me to talk about UFOs anyway, so I think everyone is really ultimately winning here. So today we are going to talk about what could potentially be the most important UFO incident out there. And I say most important because it provides potentially some of the most compelling evidence of potential UFO related activities out of pretty much any other case out there. And I believe it's also our first time venturing into Canada for a UFO story. So today we're going to be talking about the Falcon Lake Incident, and this is vividly remembered as Canada's best documented UFO case, where this 1967 encounter has intrigued both skeptics and believers alike. And today we're going to really kind of look at the narrative of the main person involved in this, Steve Michalak. We're going to look at his experience, his testimonies, additional evidence that has come from that. We're going to look at the collection of physical evidence. There is actual physical evidence in this, which you'll be potentially shocked to hear. And then we're also going to look then at the official investigation that followed all of this as well, before we finally look at some of the theories, both, settled in the real world and slightly more extraordinary, that have pretty much ensured that this case has been pretty much kept alive for the last 50 years or so. So I suppose to really just set the scene and give some background, Falcon Lake is quite a vast, rugged terrain kind of within a provincial park in Manitoba. And it's an area marked by quite dense forests and remote wilderness. And, it's really just this kind of classic UFO case where it's out in the middle of the woods. This individual either had the worst possible shit luck or the best luck in interacting with a UFO here. You can decide yourself, but it really does set the scene, and it's one of these classic kind of 1960s, 1970s UFO cases. So yeah, as I said, this area is marked by dense forests and remote wilderness, and on the 20th of May 1967, it was in this area that Stephen Michalak, who was a Polish-born industrial mechanic and amateur prospector, because why not? He set out on what would become, I think it's fair to say, a life-altering expedition. So, as we all know, and as we've talked about before, in the 1960s, North America in particular was in the midst of what was effectively UFO mania. This is following years of Cold War anxieties and, I suppose, an increasing number of aerial anomalies that were being seen throughout North America and the rest of the world. Obviously, the most famous of all of these was the Roswell incident. This is still fresh in people's memory as well. Like, don't forget, this is 1967. Roswell was 1947. Like, we're only 20 years since that. So, people are still remembering this, and I suppose the fallout, for lack of a better term, that came from the kind of the explosion that Roswell was in the UFO world. So, yeah, UFO sightings at this point were actually quite relatively common, and I suppose that's kind of just an interesting point of this period of history. Like, people were quite frequently coming forward reporting experiences with seeing UFOs and, I suppose slightly more extraordinary stories as well of interacting with aliens and things like that. But I suppose what makes this case stand out more was that cases with sustained physical evidence and then a lasting media attention as a result were quite rare. And this is what kind of makes the Falcon Lake encounter stand out among the others, among the many other cases that happened around this time. So let's jump into the timeline of this incident and kind of describe some of the details. So, as I said, it happens in May 1967. So on the 19th of May, Stephen Michalak traveled from Winnipeg to Falcon Lake and decided to spend the night at a Trans-Canada Highway motel. Then the next day, on the 20th of May 1967, in the early morning, he set off quite early, and Michalak spent some hours prospecting and chipping away at quartz veins. He was, just kind of doing his, as I said, he was an amateur prospector. He was just doing his part-time work, I guess, hobby, whatever you want to call it. He was doing some business there around some quartz veins. And the interesting thing that I find about this is that he brought a pair of welding goggles with him because he used them as standard protection from rock shrapnel, which makes total sense. You use what you've got, and obviously welding goggles is what this man had with him, which makes total sense. He was an industrial mechanic, so he would have welding goggles. So just, it all tracks anyway, but just a note. So around 12:15 p.m. Michalak heard a disturbance. He said that he heard a flock of geese suddenly taking flight, and this obviously startled him. He's out in the remote wilderness, and looking up, he said that he saw two glowing cigar-shaped red objects descending at an angle. He said one hovered while the other landed in a nearby granite outcrop, which was about 45 meters or 160 feet away from him. And then between 12:15 and 12:45 p.m., so over the next half hour, Michalak quite intently observed and sketched these crafts. He said that the craft gradually shifted from a glowing red to a stainless steel hue, and that he heard human-like voices, and at this point decided that he wanted to communicate. So he attempted to communicate to them in English first, and then tried to switch to other languages that he may have some words in. So obviously Polish, he was born in Poland, he obviously maybe tried that. He said multiple languages, so I'm sure he's got a few words in a few different languages, just trying to get some sort of communication going with them. But ultimately he received no response from the voices, and this only, I suppose, pressed his curiosity more and drove him closer to it. So he decided to approach the craft. And as he got closer, he described the craft as approximately 35 to 50 feet in diameter. He said that it had a seamless metallic surface, a dome at the top, and a door emitting this intense violet light from it. So just picture the classic flying saucer shape, and that's what you've got here. He was so close at this point that he decided to actually touch the hull with his gloved hand, and he found it so hot that he claims that his glove instantly melted touching it. He said at this point then that the craft spun and a panel of holes rotated around towards him, which would just be terrifying. So through him maybe touching the craft or something, he triggered something. I think that's kind of what's being insinuated here. It spun around and these holes were looking at him. At this point, Michalak claims that he was suddenly struck directly in the chest by a blast of hot gas or air. He's not sure which, but what he is aware of is that this hot gas or hot air immediately set his shirt and his hat ablaze, and it left this distinctive pattern of burns on his skin as a result of this. So like this caused him serious harm, actually. Like it literally lit him on fire, which is fucking wild. After this then, he claimed that he was dizzy and nauseous from whatever this was that just hit him, and he decided to immediately retreat from the site, trying to get as far away from it as he could. He said as he was trying to run away, he started vomiting repeatedly and was generally just very confused. He had no idea what was happening. So over the next approximately 3 hours, he managed to return to his motel and got there by 4 p.m. He decided through, I don't know, sheer ignorance, through fear, through whatever you want to call it, that he was going to skip any sort of medical attention until he got back to Winnipeg, which doesn't really make much sense, I suppose, to us, but I could see a world where he just wants to get back to his familiar place, knows his own doctor, trusts his doctor, and just wants to get home. I could understand that. So he basically decided he'd get back to Winnipeg that night, and he would then go to the hospital and basically report in there, and he did report in with first-degree burns on his body. So 3 days later, on the 23rd of May, the press contacted him, and they featured a story in the Winnipeg Tribune labeled "I was burned by a UFO," which, as you can imagine, quickly attracted the attention of both the authorities and the public. Pretty catching headline, especially at the time. So over the subsequent days, the 25th and 26th of May, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and other agencies initiated aerial and ground searches, but they failed to immediately locate the landing site. The objects previously claimed to have been discarded by Michalak were actually located. He claimed that he had dropped a shopping bag and an old saw that he was obviously using for cutting bits of quartz. So the interesting bit here is that like the bits that he said that he left behind, this actually matches up. They actually found what he had discarded on him, which I just find quite interesting. So flash forward a month then. So we're now the 26th of June, 1967. So after about 4 weeks of illness and alleged renewed burns, which is very interesting, Michalak claimed that he returned to the landing site with a colleague, which is wild to me. He decided that he was going to go back and basically find the landing site himself. And this time he decided to collect soil samples and burned clothing. So I don't know, for some reason the police couldn't find his burned clothing, or maybe they just didn't find the exact landing site. He knew where it was though, so he decided to go there. He got soil samples, he got the burned clothing, and allegedly some of these samples, including the soil in particular, reported these exhibited signs of radioactivity, which I just find very, very interesting. It's a classic UFO trope. So moving into the latter half then of 1967, 1968, there were a number of official and independent investigations which continued for months. There was this kind of renewed medical concerns over Michalak in particular because of the burns that kind of kept coming back. I think people were worried that he may have had radiation burns. There were a series of laboratory tests conducted on the samples that he brought back. And as I said, there was the involvement of the Canadian defense authorities, but also allegedly the American defense authorities also got in touch and were involved in this as well. The interesting thing about those two investigations though is that they apparently actually closed without a conclusive explanation, which I just find really, really interesting. And yeah, from the 1970s then through to the present, the incident became the subject of numerous books, televisions, and kind of reopened examinations. And it's pretty much just kind of become this benchmark for UFO research. And I think the really interesting thing about all of this, and maybe what lends more of an air of believability to it, is that Michalak was consistent throughout the rest of his life, that he did not deviate at all from his original story. And he stuck with this until he passed away in 1999. So he was adamant this entire time that he knew what he saw and he reported on it only as what he saw. So that's kind of the timelines. I'm going to jump a little bit more now into Michalak's testimonies because I actually find this fascinating. So this really is, I suppose, the heart of the case itself. So Michalak's he's given this very detailed narrative, and he consistently retold this narrative throughout his life. So as I said, the encounter began as two cigar-shaped, brilliantly luminous objects that descended into the daylight sky. As one landed, the other hovered a short distance before departing. And Michalak described the landed craft as a disc-shaped metallic vehicle, approximately 35 to 40 feet across and up to 10 feet thick at the center, topped by a dome. He noted that there were no seams. He couldn't see any welding marks or rivets being visible, which, you know, being an industrial mechanic, he would have an eye for these sort of things, and this is what stood out to him. He said that it actually appeared to be a single unbroken piece of metal, and he couldn't find any sort of seams at all in it, or where it kind of started or where it ended. As he, I suppose, interacted with the object, he noted that there was a door emitting this brilliant violet light, from which he said, and a direct quote, were definitely human voices sounding from it. He said that the words were quite unclear, but that he suspected some sort of military experiment or a crashed aircraft. And as I said, he called out in numerous languages, so he obviously went for English first and some Polish. And he clarified later on that he also had spoken a bit of Russian to them as well, and some words in German that he had. But as I said, he was just met with total silence. And that is, I suppose, even eerier, is that he called out and received nothing at all. As he drew closer to the object and he peered into the open hatch, he said that he glimpsed an array of colored panel lights, beams, and this computer-like display, and that suddenly these three panels slid across the door, sealing the opening. So it's almost like as he approached the object and looked in, whoever or whatever was in the craft didn't want him looking into it, and immediately kind of switched it all down, shut it down, locked him out, making sure he wasn't getting in there. As I said, then he attempted to touch the surface of the craft, which resulted in a melted glove. When the vessel then spun around, he faced this grid-like pattern of holes, and at that moment he said a blast of hot gas gas or some sort of exhaust or something hit him squarely in the chest and set his shirt and cap on fire, resulting in first-degree burns. He described this, and there's a kind of a direct quote here, of instantly feeling a wave of nausea, a blinding, splitting headache, and a foul stench. He compared the smell itself to that of sulfur or burnt electrical insulation, which again he would be familiar with, and his skin showed burns and lesions on it, like quite severe burns and lesions on it. As I said, first-degree burns. He vomited repeatedly, and he said that when he reached his motel, he was so dizzy and confused that he avoided contact with others, and basically, through some sort of deduction, was actually afraid that he might be radioactive due to the vomiting and the burns. Let's not forget as well, this is 1960s in North America. People are very, very well aware of what radiation sickness looks like from all the videos and stuff that they'll be shared. Like the Cold War is in operation. Like the people know what radiation burns look like. They are very familiar with them. And no doubt Michalak was trying to self-diagnose. I don't know. So as he thought he was radioactive, the next part doesn't really make any sense. He decided to get the bus back to Winnipeg. So he, I don't know, maybe thought that he was safer on the bus. Immediately though, when he got back, he was taken to the hospital. And the interesting thing that I find about this is that his actual family recounted that when they saw him for the first time, there was a strong, harsh smell. They said they compared it to sulfur or burnt motor oil, and they said that it actually permeated from him and actually hung in the room in the hospital. So this smell was actually coming from him. So I just thought it was very interesting that the smell that he reported, his family are actually saying like, yeah, it's coming from him. It's not from the surrounding area. So I've talked about these burns and things like that and debris that was left, and I want to just touch on this. So this is probably the most important part of this case, and I talked about it at the start, that this stands out from others because it has physical evidence. So obviously we have the medical evidence and injuries. So his burns were quite vast and quite bad, and medical documentation by the hospital confirmed that he had first-degree burns over his chest and abdomen, and they were initially described as irregular and oval-shaped lesions, the size and shape reminiscent of what he described as a grid-like exhaust panel. Later then, a shirt with a burnt pattern matching a grid was also photographed and presented as evidence, I suppose backing up exactly where he was burned. But it is important to note that not all experts did agree that the burns on Michalak's skin exactly matched those on the shirt, just to acknowledge that. And the other issues that he had was this persistent illness that I talked about. So in the ensuing weeks and months after, Michalak suffered from recurring headaches. He had nausea, weight loss. He reported blackouts, chronic episodes of vomiting, and unfortunately diarrhea as well. So this dude was not having a good time. These symptoms, I suppose, were variously being compared throughout the years to radiation poisoning, but ultimately remained undiagnosed. He even described these recurring outbreaks over the burns, sometimes appearing in the grid pattern over a year later. So he's talking about these burns coming back up, like they're re-emerging, and I think that maybe gives more credence to potential radiation burns there, because I believe that's something that happens with radiation burns, is that they can kind of come back up after a period of time, and this kind of would be consistent with that. He was actually referred to the Mayo Clinic then in 1968, and it was, while it was a medical evaluation, he was also brought in for a psychiatric evaluation. And the important thing to emphasize here is that doctors actually found no clear psychological disorders with him. They described him as a pragmatic and rational person, and they were satisfied with him. They did, however, diagnose his lesions later on as factital, meaning that they were basically self-inflicted, but without overt mental illness. So I think they were pretty much saying that the dude did it to himself for attention, but they didn't want to directly call it as that. You can really read into that however you want to. And yeah, so as I mentioned, there was also then, along with this evidence, there was the clothing and equipment that he brought with him. So physical evidence involved in this include Michalak's burnt shirts, the melted glove, a singed cap, and the goggles that he was wearing that were distorted by heat. So these items were subjected to testing by multiple laboratories, and medical records and photographic documentation back up the claim of this damage. So there is evidence out there to show that, yeah, this is pretty consistent with what he said. The soil samples that were taken at the alleged landing site, which was a circular area approximately 15 feet in diameter, were found to be devoid of moss or vegetation. So I don't know what that potentially could be, maybe radiation or or something else, or insane heat. But I suppose the interesting thing is that allegedly in the area, for an area of this large diameter to be devoid of any moss or vegetarian, it's striking, because the rest of the area is thriving with plant life and such. And the soil samples tested positive for localized radioactive contamination. They were initially evaluated as potentially dangerous, though later assessments suggested that the radiation was no greater than that from, say, an old watch dial or mining remnants, which, if he's prospecting in the area, potentially there are discarded mining remnants up there in the area that leach into the soil or something like that. It's very possible that could have happened, and that's what was picked up in the soil analysis. And something else that I saw mentioned along with the evidence that I can't really find much for, allegedly there was some metallic fragments. So on subsequent visits to the site after it was identified, allegedly some metallic debris, which was later identified as nearly pure silver, so it was 95% pure silver apparently, with trace radioactivity, was actually pulled from rock cracks at the site. And some experts have suggested that this could have been contaminated by natural radium, the kind of radium deposits, or that it could have been deliberately hoaxed by dipping it in radioactive ores. But definitive proof or explanation hasn't been found. But just to acknowledge that this nearly pure silver was actually had trace amounts of radioactivity on it. So I can't really find anything else on that, but I just thought it was very interesting that the area did have something else there. As I said, it could be from previous mining remnants in the area, that it's leached into the soil, or it's caused issues, or it's from a UFO. Who are we to know? So getting more then into the radioactivity and things like that. So as I said, the soil samples were taken, tape measures of the area were also looked at, and the clothing that was provided by Michalak, they all reportedly tested positive for some amounts of radiation. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police initially came out and said that it was, quote, significantly high amounts, that was a possible serious health hazard. But then the Department of National Defence and a nuclear research establishment reviewed it, and they actually argued that the radioactivity was highly localized and less than that present in radium paint, which was used in luminous watches at the time. So they're saying that it's maybe slightly higher than normal, but it's not dangerous in any way. So it kind of directly contradicts what the Mounted Police are saying. The type of radiation revealed, so there was gamma spectrometry done on the site, and it revealed that the presence of radium-226 and its decay products. So this is actually apparently quite consistent with radium-based paint or geological pitchblende ore. So both of these items were historically available in Canada, and they were actually sometimes used illicitly in mining surveys during this era as well. So, it's kind of lending a little bit more credence to remnants of mining there that would account for the radiation. As I said, the metallic debris from the site was largely pure silver, but there was some amount of radiation to it. Some experts have come out after this now to say that this actually could be evidence of a possible hoax, and that this kind of directly points to it. But as I said, it's difficult to find any sort of additional analysis on the metallic fragments, which it's interesting anyway. And then Michalak himself, it's just important to note, the Mayo Clinic, when they did their assessments on him, they found no significant levels of internal radiation, and this kind of undercuts any claim of his exposure to a large persistent doses, because they looked at them and they said they couldn't find any evidence of it. But it could be magic space radiation for all we know. Who's to say? So then, looking at the official investigations that I mentioned, there were quite a few involved in this, so I'm gonna break it into various different groups. So on the Canadian side, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Royal Canadian Air Force conducted interviews. They visited Michalak's home, they examined evidence, and they carried out multiple site searches. And they actually took custody of all of the evidence and coordinated laboratory analysis. They also engaged in with the Department of Health, and a nuclear research center as well, and they looked at the radiological studies and environmental safety checks to kind of determine that the danger was minimal and it posed no harm to the greater public. And they also, with the Mounties and I believe the Air Force, they went out and did ground and aerial searches as well, just to confirm all of this. Once Michalak did bring the investigators to the site, they reported seeing evidence of of burnt moss, vegetation being gone, and the localized radiological anomalies. But the issue there is that they waited for him to bring them there. They couldn't actually find it themselves. So, that does kind of, it gives a lot of ammunition to people that talk about it being a hoax, is that he brought them there. They don't know how long he could have potentially been doing this for at the site, or whatever it was that he was potentially doing. And then on the American and international side of things, I did talk about how the Americans did get involved at some point. So the University of Colorado UFO project actually got involved, and this was part of a United States Air Force funded scientific project. And Professor Ray Craig and others from the university interviewed Michalak, and they reviewed actually the evidence and the testimonial evidence as well. And they actually released a report in 1969 flagging the case as unexplained. They did emphasize that there was a lack of corroborating witnesses and conflicting medical details, and there was also a possibility of natural or artificial contamination of evidence, but they weren't satisfied to come down on a conclusion ultimately. The Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, so APRO, and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, these are civilian UFO research bodies. They approached Michalak and got permission to photograph his injuries, and they continued to monitor his health. They also, basically said that this was very, very similar to other UFO cases from around the world where people had close encounters and such, and it was consistent with what was reported from them as well. And over subsequent months, the Department of National Defense, the Nuclear Research Center, and various members of the Canadian Parliament also received quite intense public and unpublished internal correspondence, basically demanding the release of file materials and further explanations to this. So the public was very much so interested in this. The involvement of the UFO organizations kind of helped cement the Falcon Lake incident's global reputation. So these bodies that came in there, it really solidified this as a classic UFO case and really ensured that it's still known about today. Finally, we're going to get into some theories. So let's start with the, I suppose, conventional explanations and some skepticism. So skeptical arguments about the Falcon Lake incident have highlighted numerous inconsistencies, mistakes, and possible motives for hoaxes or error or whatever you want to call it. So the first key bit of evidence here is the burns. So a lot of people have said, and particularly the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Department of National Defence, they think that these burns were accidental burns that were alcohol related. They posited that Michalak's injuries could have resulted from accidental contact with a camp stove, a barbecue, or even some drunken misadventure in the wilderness. And through sheer shame, or whatever you want to call it, he decided to mask his burns with what they described as a respectable UFO story, which is pretty wild when you think about it, but I can see the angle that they're going for there. We talked about it already, the radium paint hoax. So given the historical misuse of radium-based luminescent paint, particularly used in watches or military dials or in mining tools, don't forget he is a prospector, chemists and astronomers have speculated that Michalak, or potentially another party out of his knowledge, could have fabricated the radioactive evidence or merely encountered discarded industrial waste, and that led to the radiation evidence that's there. It was suggested that, though never really, I suppose, conclusively established, that Michalak may have invented or exaggerated this whole encounter to ward off rival prospectors from a valuable mineral claim, which doesn't really stand really with me, because the massive public attention ultimately flooded the area with far more would-be prospectors because of everything that was going on. So I'm not really 100% on board with that one. People have also pointed out to testimony inconsistencies. So critics have pointed to discrepancies in Michalak's account. They talked about the changing pattern on his burns, the late provision of evidence and site locations, and then the conflicting stories regarding his earlier refusal to show police his damaged shirt or expose precise map coordinates. I don't really know about that. I couldn't find much talking about refusal to show police, but it's curious that he was initially hesitant to engage with the police until he had reported on this. Really, actually, it was only until after the media had reported did he provide more evidence. So let's get into some extraterrestrial hypotheses. So UFO researchers staunchly argue that the extraordinary physical evidence, the multiple investigations, and Michalak's unwavering consistency effectively elevate about this case pretty much above all others. They actually point to the classic flying saucer description as a strength. So Michalak's sketches basically match the saucer motif of the 50s and 60s. These kind of UFO reports of silvery, seamless craft with a dome and grid-like apertures. They say the presence of human-like voices and advanced lighting control could potentially infer some sort of contact with a technologically sophisticated but not potentially alien artifact. They also then point to the physical injuries as UFO evidence. So there's few other world UFO cases which have resulted in the level of documented persistent physical injury to a witness as there is in Falcon Lake. The grid-like burns and their recurrence is pretty much the main topic of debate on this, and it's often cited as empirical evidence for unknown energies or materials causing these injuries. They also then point to the government documentation and defense interests. So there's this persistent engagement by military and health authorities, coupled with eventual declassification but inconclusive results, which kind of sparked more suspicion of a cover-up or counterintelligence operations. And then they also point then to Michalak himself. So Michalak, he actually has a background as a war veteran and was a former military policeman in Poland. He also apparently had a total lack of apparent financial gain from this. And a lot of UFO researchers feel that this in particular makes deliberate fraud appear less plausible to many of them. And ultimately his family's testimony, particularly from his son, also has consistently insisted on his honesty and reluctance for publicity from this. So, you know, they're very similar avenues of theories, both the skeptic and believer theories, but they're just, I suppose, framed in different ways, which is the important thing here, you know, and it really does kind of show that depending on whatever side you come down on, you have very different ways of interpreting evidence, which is just really, really interesting. So before we finish, just to acknowledge that the media coverage around this, the public reaction and the cultural impact have really just enhanced its legacy. So it's fair to say that this became a bit of a press sensation. Within days, regional newspapers had published long accounts talking about Michalak's injuries. The headline, obviously, as I said at the start, was "I was burned by a UFO," and there was just this surge in public interest around it. There were numerous, I suppose, books and TVs and films that have come out of it. There's even memorials and collectibles. The Royal Canadian Mint actually in 2018 released a $20 commemorative coin with glow-in-the-dark features simulating a UFO exhaust, which I just find hilarious. And yeah, Michalak's personal belongings, including the burned clothing, were actually donated to the University of Manitoba archives in 2019. So, you know, it's still very much so talked about. And ultimately, it's become a tourist location coming out of all of this. And yeah, as I said, people point to Michalak after this whole issue and this whole incident. So the incident, it's fair to say, took a fairly marked toll on the Michalak family. His son, Stan, has recounted how media attention and skepticism placed quite enormous pressure on family life, and it led to what can only be described as just isolation for the family. They receded into themselves and didn't really engage with anyone. And to this day, the family does stand by his account, emphasizing his honesty and the ordeal that this actually had on Stephen. So yeah, that kind of concludes it. So I really suppose, in summary, the Falcon Lake incident remains this, I think it's fair to say, an unparalleled case study for not only Canadian UFO history, but for anyone who's intrigued by this, I suppose, collision of first-hand testimony, unexplained physical evidence, and the search for truth in this whole kind of field, this crowded area. You know, it's just a really, really interesting case. And I suppose it leads you to kind of ask the sort of questions of, you know, was Stephen Michalak the victim of a truly kind of anomalous paranormal event? Did he inadvertently stumble upon some early Cold War military experiment? Or does this story kind of serve as caution that some stories, you know, may be more fantastic than they actually appear to be, that this could ultimately be a hoax? Who are we to know? And I think the kind of nice thing about this is that we may never know. And yeah, it's a mystery that just continues to fascinate everyone who kind of looks into it. And that's something that I really like about it. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this quite different, informative episode from myself. It's a very different one than I usually do. And I'm aware that it's run on much longer than they usually do as well. But yeah, I really enjoyed kind of looking into this a little bit more, doing a bit more research and things like that. Getting together a list of references that I actually have as well. So Suze will be shocked that I actually have a list here. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear where you come on this story. Do you think it's, this compelling encounter with a UFO, or is it a hoax, or potentially something in between? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You can get us on social media at Instagram and Threads at the Spooky F Pod. You can also send us an email on Gmail at the spookyfpodcast@gmail.com, and we're also on YouTube. Every time a new episode comes up, you can post in the comments, and we'd be more than happy to respond to you. But yeah, I'd also, as I said, love your feedback on this type of episode. It would be great to see if you like this sort of long form conversation between myself and yourself, the listener. With that said, I hope you're having a lovely day whenever it is you're listening to this, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.